A federal judge in Maryland has issued a nationwide order which blocks President Donald Trump's executive order which ends birthright citizenship. Hello, everyone. This is Andre McKinney Dorval. By now, we have heard that a second judge, a federal judge in Maryland, has entered a nationwide order preliminarily blocking the executive order ending birthright citizenship from going into effect, at least while the lawsuit is pending. Now, I am going to share my screen. We're going to take a look at a news article that gives an account on the federal judge in Maryland's order that was entered on today. Now, before we take a look at and read sections of this article, I want to share with you a little bit of a recap. The executive order ending birthright citizenship was entered on January 20th. Now, on January 21st, the state of Washington, along with a few other states, they filed a lawsuit in Washington. On January 23rd, the judge in the Washington case entered a nationwide temporary order for 14 days. That 14-day period ends on February 6th. Meanwhile, on February 5th, a federal judge in Maryland has entered a preliminary injunction, which is nationwide, in the Maryland case. Now, you may wonder, what's the difference between the two orders? Well, the temporary order that the Washington federal judge entered, that was only for 14 days to give that judge enough time to review the preliminary injunction that the state of Washington and the plaintiffs filed, along with any opposition documents that the government may have filed. Now, the judge in Maryland has heard the preliminary injunction filed in that case. And the main difference is that a preliminary injunction is a type of request. If the judge grants it, that means the judge is going to put a block or a hold on, in this case, the government's executive order from taking effect while the parties litigate the case. Now, let's take a little look at this article entitled, Judge Blocks Trump's Bid to Restrict Birthright Citizenship. Now, it states that a U.S. federal judge has blocked Donald Trump's attempt to end birthright citizenship. And then it goes on to quote, today, virtually every baby born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen upon birth. Now, this is a quote from the Maryland District Judge, Deborah Boardman. She's quoted as saying this upon her ruling. She goes on to state, per this quote, that is the law and tradition of our country. Now let's take a little bit deeper read into this article. It goes on to state the Trump administration can appeal against the ruling, and in fact is expected to do so according to what some experts have indicated. Now, let's move a little bit further. Now, this article goes on to reference that the executive order, which was scheduled to come into effect on February 19th, would withhold automatic citizenship rights from newborns if either of their parents was if neither, of their parents was a U.S. citizen or lawful permanent resident. Now, let's read further on. Now, this article recognizes that the ruling comes 2 weeks after a federal judge in Seattle called Trump's order blatantly unconstitutional and issued a 14-day restraining order. The ruling will expire on Thursday, which is February 6th, when that judge will hold another hearing. Now, guys, I'm going to now go a little bit further down, and I want to explain to you another key difference between the Washington lawsuit and the Maryland lawsuit. Now, for starters, these two lawsuits are filed in different federal circuits, and that just means different federal judges. And so while the lawsuit challenging the executive order that was filed in Seattle, that was brought by the state of Washington and a couple of other states. The case in Maryland, that case was brought by, included 5 pregnant undocumented women who filed their case in Maryland, and they argued, or likely argued, that they would be uniquely harmed by the executive order, namely because they are pregnant. So with the 2 individual states, so we have with the individual states, the case in Washington, and the Maryland case with the 5 pregnant women, uh, it's likely that both of these plaintiffs argued or made different arguments as to what type of harm they would suffer. So those 2 cases quite reasonably could present different reasons to the judges as to why the judge should enter a preliminary injunction while the case is being litigated. So I just wanted to share that distinction with you, and we'll talk a little bit more about that as we continue in the content of this video. Now let's take a look at this article, which discusses the Washington case. Now, this article is entitled Federal Judge in Seattle Revisits Trump's Order to End Birthright Citizenship. And so let's take a little read. And it indicates U.S. District Judge John Coffiner in Seattle was the first to block President Donald Trump's executive order. And they quote the judge in Seattle as stating, he's quoted as saying that the executive order was blatantly unconstitutional, and that was at the initial hearing on January 23rd. Let's continue to read. The case continues at a hearing before Judge Coffiner on Thursday, February 6th. Now, this article goes on to indicate that 2 weeks ago, Judge Coffiner granted their request, referring to the states, for a temporary restraining order that prohibited government agencies from taking any steps to implement these changes for 14 days. And guys, we discussed some of what the executive order directed federal agencies, what action it told them to take to make sure that the birthright citizenship executive order went into effect. Now, this article continues to state that then, as that order was set to expire this week on February 6th, a federal judge in Maryland agreed, approving a preliminary injunction that keeps the order on hold nationwide, while legal questions are resolved. Now, this article states that, but despite the judge's ruling, multiple lawsuits are expected to keep moving forward. And remember, guys, we talked about several states in the U.S. have filed lawsuits in federal district courts. Now, this article goes on to read that Mike Falk, spokesperson for the Washington Attorney General's office, said they will seek their own preliminary injunction at Thursday's hearing in Seattle, and Thursday referring to February 6th. This article goes on to state, he said, referring to Mr. Falk, the representative for the state of Washington, the administration can and is expected to appeal any adverse rulings, including the Maryland injunction, and may seek to stay any injunctions. We need an injunction in our case, referring to the Washington case, to guarantee that the plaintiff's state's interests are protected regardless of what other courts do. And we'll talk a little bit about what that means. Now, this article goes on to conclude that Matt Adams, legal director at the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project, welcomed the Maryland decision, but said he hopes the Seattle case and others are allowed to proceed in case the Maryland decision is overturned. And that's going to be important, guys. And he goes on to state that I would expect to see appeals in at least 2 or 3 of those cases, if not all four of those cases, as the federal government is trying to pretty much throw mud at the wall to see if something will stick somewhere, Adam states. So, what are the takeaways based on the Maryland judge, the federal judge in Maryland? A few takeaways. Now we know that, and let me stop sharing screen. I shared with you that the order that the Maryland judge entered is a preliminary injunction. And that just means that while the plaintiffs and the government in the Maryland case are litigating it, the executive order signed by President Trump cannot go into effect. But remember, as I stated, guys, that lawsuit is in the state of Maryland. And so that is a different circuit. Now, if the government takes an appeal in the Maryland case, which is expected that the government will file an appeal, it's going to go to the appellate court that is over the Maryland federal court. Now, on February 6th, the federal judge who entered the 14-day temporary order that blocked the executive order, on February 6th, that judge is going to determine whether or not that judge is either going to grant the preliminary injunction that the states, that in that case, that they're asking for, or that judge could extend the 14-day temporary restraining order. As of right now, it's unknown and unclear what will take place. Now, in the article that we looked at, it talked about that the state of Washington is still moving forward because they don't know how their case will end up, meaning if the federal judge in Washington grants what the state of Washington is asking, which is a preliminary injunction as well, then the government is prepared to file a lawsuit, is prepared to file an appeal challenging that. So a few questions are unknown right now, and that is, which case will be the first to make it to the Supreme Court to ultimately decide this birthright citizenship issue? Now, it should be noted that the government, the Department of Justice falls within the executive branch of government. So that means that the government has more than 10,000 attorneys to argue its position all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is likely going to happen. It's unclear if that's going to take months or years. But for now, this is a victory for those who are pregnant and have a level of uncertainty of what is to come when they give birth to their children. So guys, please be sure to share this video, subscribe to the channel for more. Of course, whatever happens in the Washington case, I will certainly keep you guys updated on that. And I do thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one. Bye-bye.